From fights over whether nursing home deaths deserve an investigation, to tracking down COVID scams, to putting a non-compliant restaurant owner in jail, Michigan's Attorney General is a fixture in the headlines. Dana Nessel is here to talk about it all. And a freshman congressman from Michigan who seemed to jump right into the Washington fire. Our first Flashpoint conversation with Representative Peter Meijer. Today is Easter Sunday, April 4th, 2021, and this is Flashpoint.
Hi, welcome to Flashpoint. A very happy Easter to you and yours. I'm delighted you're spending this Sunday morning with us. And safe and warm inside is probably the best advice again, as we've watched COVID cases jump by an alarming degree. This past week, Michigan showed more recent cases per capita than any other state, and that after such a promising decline in cases. Now, with more seniors having had the vaccines, the cases are skewing younger, and exhausted healthcare workers are right back in the swale. Against that backdrop, there is a lot of misinformation that keeps making the rounds on social media, and more than a few scammers who see, of course, a lot of opportunity in the crisis. That's just one of the matters begging the attention of Attorney General Dana Nessel. From Line 5 to Flint Water, from U.S. gymnastics to demands from GOP lawmakers, and that doesn't include the recent comments about her from the state's Republican chairman. The Attorney General will join us in just a moment. And a little later on, our first conversation with one of the new members of the Michigan congressional delegation. Peter Meijer quickly ran afoul of many fellow Republicans in voting to impeach President Trump after the attack on the U.S. Capitol. Well, now he has President Biden's massive infrastructure bill to consider. Way too expensive to most of his colleagues, and yet a lot built into it for Michigan's automakers. We'll talk to him, too, all today on Flashpoint. Well, let's assume Dana Nessel's desk has been reinforced with steel braces and supports, lest it collapse beneath the weight of the many issues facing the Attorney General. Very good to have Dana Nessel back with us again on Flashpoint. Attorney General Nessel, it's always good to have you. I want to, off the top, let's quickly dispense with Ron Weiser's recent comments. He referred to you and Governor Whitmer and Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson as witches. Now, he has apologized for what he said, though that is not enough for those who want to see him resign from the U of M Board of Regents, including his fellow regents, as of Friday morning. He says he's refusing to be canceled. So let me let you react to what's happened.
Well, Devin, first of all, thanks for having me. Mm-hmm. You know, it's not a matter of being canceled. It's being held accountable for your words and words that inspire very dangerous actions. And what we've seen from the Michigan Republican Party as of late, and this is not just from Ron Weiser, but also from his co-chair, Michonne Maddox, you know, this dehumanization and demonization of their political opponents. So calling us witches, calling us the three-headed monster, calling us evil. Those types of statements allow others to act in a manner that actually is dangerous for the three of us and for all elected officials when we talk about assassinating people, when we talk about burning people at the stake. It's never appropriate to talk about one's political opponents in these terms. And I think it's important to understand that when people hear that, there are some people who then see that as a call to action. And why wouldn't you take up arms against someone who you've described now as evil? I mean, you're doing a society a favor, I guess, by taking us out. I mean, that's what leads to the rise in domestic terrorism in this nation. And we have seen this movie before, right? And we know that, in fact, in the case involving the plot to kidnap and execute the governor, that these individuals reappropriated the exact same language that we heard Donald Trump using about our governor in their effort to, you know, what they had hoped to be a murder plot. And so it's very dangerous language. And I think it's so important that elected leaders, party leaders not engage in that kind of very hateful and angry rhetoric.
It really speaks to how fraught our political discourse has become, and that leads me into our next topic. You've got a lot of GOP lawmakers not so much asking as demanding that you investigate the governor and the state of Michigan's nursing home policy through those first early months of the pandemic. I guess there's two problems for a prosecutor's office, and that would be allowing someone to talk you into investigating something out of of political malice. But I guess the other problem would be not investigating something out of political fealty. Tell me a little bit about how you're approaching this and why Republicans are wrong in their request.
Well, first of all, my job as a prosecutor has to be completely nonpartisan. So if you look at my track record, for instance, I have investigated and in many cases prosecuted a lot of notable Democrats in the state, including the Southfield city clerk and the Macomb County prosecutor. I investigated the governor when asked to do so last year in terms of the contact tracing contracts. So I'm not afraid to investigate members of my own party. But when it comes to this particular event, the problem is this. There is just no evidence of any kind that there was any sort of criminal activity. And when I've asked over and over again for Republicans to give me even a prima facie case of anything the governor did that, in fact, was criminal in regard to a policy that we know was never actually implemented, they're unable to do so. So how does that allow me as a prosecutor, just cause to mount an investigation when there's no indication of any kind that there was a crime that was committed?
There are some, though, who draw a similarity between this and the Flint water case, where you have an acting administrator, a governor, who maybe with the best of intentions, nonetheless bears responsibility for what happens further down the line from those decisions. How would you draw a distinction between those two cases?
Well, I think there are many distinctions, but let me say this. When I entered office, remember that Attorney General Bill Schuette had already launched an investigation and, in fact, had charged over a dozen people. So I inherited this investigation. I inherited all of these cases. Now, not to say that Attorney General Schuette was in the wrong for having launched that investigation, but when I came into office, that investigation was already well underway.
True, but I don't think you've taken issue with it.
Well, to be fair, I was not part of the investigation. Just so it's clear, there's a conflict wall, and I was not involved in any way, shape, or form with the investigation or the prosecutions on account of me having handled, of course, the civil cases. Right. So I'm unable to say specifically what evidence exists or doesn't exist for what I read in the papers, which is the same thing, of course, that you and the media report on. Yeah. But I will say that those are very different incidences. In terms of what occurred in Flint, I mean, this was obviously a man-made disaster that didn't have to happen. COVID, on the other hand, is a global pandemic. And what we know is that the numbers in Michigan were not different from the numbers in other states as it impacted our nursing home population. And that's one of the things that, of course, I really struggle with in determining, even if this policy had been implemented, that it was a bad policy to begin with, because we just haven't seen that borne out by the statistics. So to me, to launch this investigation, again, with no indication of any criminal activity whatsoever, that in itself would be partisan.
Is Pete Lucido barking up the wrong tree and going ahead with his own investigation, or is that within his rights as county prosecutor in Macomb?
While I would say, of course, that he's an independently elected office holder with prosecutorial authority, it bothers me a lot to see someone say, I don't have any evidence of a crime. Please, people, bring me some sort of evidence that would allow me to move forward with an investigation. That's not normally how it happens. What happens when you're a county prosecutor is, generally speaking, you have law enforcement who have had reports of some sort of criminal activity. They then bring it to the county prosecutor, who reviews it. They, of course, can ask for further investigation before they authorize or deny a warrant, but it's very unusual to start with the prosecutor and to say, bring me evidence of a crime when you don't already have any of it. And I think it's very telling, of course, that Lucido himself has indicated that he can't execute any search warrants. Why? Because he doesn't have probable cause that any crime existed. To
carry them out. I've got a number of issues I want to get to here in just a couple minutes that we have left. First off, let's stay with the pandemic. You have been, in fact, you've done some great videos trying to help older Michiganders not getting scammed, but this is becoming a massive problem in the middle of the pandemic, these scams.
It absolutely is, and it's been a problem for quite some time. And unfortunately, our seniors are the most vulnerable population to fall victim to them. And what I had planned before 2020 had other plans for me and for everyone, was to do a series of consumer protection town halls all around the state to inform seniors about these pernicious scams that have robbed individuals in our state of hundreds of millions of dollars. But of course, I couldn't do those in person. So I thought the best way possible to let people know about them was through a series of videos that we are continuing to film. But, it's very important that people pay attention, that people understand what spoofing is, that, anything can come into your phone or onto your computer that looks like it's from a legitimate source that isn't, and that you never, ever provide your personal information to someone when you don't even know who you're talking to. It's very dangerous. The other thing I'd love to tell your viewers about is a new division in our office where we are dedicated to assisting those who have been victims of identity theft to help people rebuild their credit. It is such an arduous, difficult process.
Yes.
And while, of course, we can always prosecute people and try to get restitution for them once they have been victimized, and we do that all the time, millions of dollars a year that we are able to reimburse people, we would prefer that people never become victims in the first place.
I got to make sure I get to USA Gymnastics. You've got a number of parents and people who've watched around this program very upset that the investigation kind of reached a dead end. I sense that you also have some frustration, but at the end of the day, you weren't able to get around the law to get Michigan state leadership to be able to testify the way you wanted them to. Is that it in a nutshell?
Well, essentially, in 2018, the Board of Trustees for Michigan State University actually requested that the Department of Attorney General do an investigation and get to the bottom of everything that occurred involving the Nassar scandal. And instead, what they ended up doing was to stonewall our investigation. So they kept some 6,000 or more emails from the Department of Attorney General that did not allow us to complete our investigation, despite the fact that they are the ones that asked for it in the first place. And yes, those emails are protected by attorney-client privilege.
Right.
But if you weren't going to cooperate with the investigation, why ask us to do it in the first place? It's really disturbing.
I've only got 30 seconds left. Can you make any comment right now on what's happening with Line 5 now that the Canadian government has said that this is not arguable? We have to have that line in place.
Well, I think that's absolutely untrue. And I have every reason to believe that the governor and I are going to be successful on this matter in court. And in doing so, we'll save Michigan from potentially the worst catastrophic oil spill in American history.
We will talk about that further. That deserves an entire program on its own. Attorney General Nessel, it's always good to have you back on the program. Thanks so much for the time. Stay safe. We'll talk to you again soon.
You too. Thanks for having me.
You bet. Back with more. We'll talk with Congressman Peter Meijer next on Flashpoint on Local 4.